My name is Nick Dranias. I am President and Executive Director from Compact for America Educational Foundation. I believe on the line with me is CEO Chip DeMoss and also Cesar Balmaceda, who's a Director of New Way Foundation, one of our critical partners in this effort. Real briefly, my background is in law. I'm not licensed in Tennessee, but I'm licensed in 5 jurisdictions now. I've been practicing for 20 years. I have 1 Supreme Court win under my belt. I was at the Goldwater Institute for about 8 years. I was at the Institute for Justice for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was in private practice in Chicago. Don't hold it against me. The reason why I emphasize this is that this is a matter that requires both expertise in policy and an understanding of the law of interstate compacts. And I've been focused in interstate compact law, which is mostly federal, for the past 5-6 years. Compact for America is an organization that is organized for the purpose of advancing public policies through interstate compacts. Interstate compacts are agreements among the states similar to treaties. My belief is that anything you can do in statute, you can do better in compact, and this idea is a clear example of that. Most famously, Compact for America is known for the Balanced Budget Compact, which is an effort to advance a balanced budget amendment through the states. There are now 4 states in that compact that has created an interstate commission that is engaging with Congress as we speak to get Congress partnering with the states on that effort. This effort is not an amendment effort. It has nothing to do with Article 5, but pound for pound, it is my opinion and my belief that this is the most powerful reform idea I've ever seen. And when we get to the end of this, I think you'll see it as well, and we're glad to have you on board. So the way I'm going to structure this is I'm going to go through a slide presentation of the opportunities and tremendous economic growth that can happen with the Prosperity States Compact, and a walkthrough at a sort of a treetop to somewhere between treetop and 50,000 foot level of what's in the model policy, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. So for the sake of speed and efficiency, I am going to proceed in that direction right now. If there is a burning question that you have to ask at the time that I'm in this slide, go ahead. Do not be bashful, but I guarantee that you will have questions to lob at me at the end, and plenty of time for my answers if you want to hang for them. But if you have any time constraints, hit me early. All right, the first thing to emphasize in this is the opportunity that exists for a state that decides to go the route of a Prosperity States Compact member. Right now, there's a huge amount of investment money on the sidelines. The estimates are over $30 trillion. They're looking for things to invest in that are profitable, which are increasingly hard to find, not just in our economy, but also the world. That's why you're seeing around the world special economic zones, zones of superior public policy in a given host country being created. The King Abdullah Economic City is an example. Earlier examples include Dubai. And you're also seeing places like Estonia coming out of the communist bloc with some of the most free market policies in the world. There's a lot of effort to generate these distinct policy environments so that you can draw this investment capital. And any state that joins the Prosperity States Compact is going to find it amazingly helpful for economic growth, and I'm about to show you how helpful. But before we talk about the opportunity, it's important to emphasize the problem that we face. This is not just an economic opportunity. This is also a fundamental societal problem that we can fix if we get the Prosperity States Initiative rooted in your local community. And that problem is everywhere we go, regulations mushrooming. And it's a deeper problem than just thousands of regulations. We all know that. It's that our culture has changed from one where neighbors fix problems to there ought to be a law for that. And it's really important, if we're going to have a free society, for people to take responsibility for their own interactions with others and not look to offload that responsibility to government every time they can. The other thing is no matter what we've been doing in the past 8 to 10 years, the economic growth has been disastrous. And it's in large part because government's been messing around with things, but it's also because we've been building up the size and intrusiveness of regulatory policy. The other thing that you notice, and I'm sure you see this in every state, including Tennessee, is that local control is becoming illusory. I mean, cities and towns are chasing federal grants that have so many strings attached that, in effect, not only do you see at the state level, in some places nearly half of the budget controlled by federal policy because of the grants that are being accepted, but at local governmental level, supposedly the closest to the people, supposedly where local control is most important, you see policies being driven by federal dictates and priorities, and that's a huge problem, again, for building the character of the citizen that we need. And related to that is the fact that state sovereignty is becoming more and more meaningless. Instead of an equal partner in our system of federalism, states are instrumentalities increasingly of the federal government. Lastly, all of these combine to eroding any sense of limitation on government. And as I said from the beginning, people look to the government now increasingly to fix everything instead of their own community, their own neighbors, their family. There's nothing more destructive to the civic order we need to maintain a republic. And the simple fact is this: the vision that Ronald Reagan spoke of a shining city on a hill doesn't make any sense to people anymore. People don't know what freedom looks like. We need to create the image of freedom again, the reality of freedom, for people to see what it means. It wasn't, parachuting boatloads of freedom to choose by Milton Friedman into the Soviet Union that brought it down. Most principally, it was the vision of East Berlin, its neon lights, the promise of freedom and happiness that eventually convinced millions of people in the Eastern Bloc that they had enough of the communist experiment. We need to start heading off what appears to be an increasing level of experimentation with big government and bad policy in every state. And the best way to do that is to create outposts of freedom that are undeniably prosperous. So what is the model that we're advancing here? It's called the Special Economic Zone, or the SEZ model. The idea is to have a space where you take the full suite of best practices. We can call them free market practices. We can call them limited government practices. But really what these practices are is maximizing individual responsibility and freedom and minimizing the role of coercive government planning. The key thing here is to ensure that you have the entire suite of best practices, not just the incremental change here and there, because the goal, the policy goal, is to transform an area dramatically through freedom, through limited government, so that 5 to 10 years later, ordinary people who are not versed in the fineries of free market economics or philosophy can look, can point, and can prove that freedom works in their community. One of the other important things about the SEZ concept that we're advancing is that we want these not to be anyone's special fiefdom. They are meant to be easily formed and easily expanded so that they do not remain an enclave, that in fact they can be replicated, that they can expand, that if people want what they see, they can have it. The other important element of this is that we don't want these SEZs, like they are in so many other places, imposed on people. We don't want them driven from the top down without knowledge of the conditions on the ground, without knowledge of the local culture or desires. We want them to be driven from the ground up. And so the formation of any SEZ at the outset is always going to be 100% voluntary outside of cities in our model. And that literally means everyone who has a property interest, everyone who lives there is going to have to agree to form it in order for it to be formed. And this is to bring into stark reality the notion of the consent of the governed, and to make sure that we're implanting these deep reforms in fertile ground, because again, the purpose is to show that this works in 5 to 10 years. We don't want to have any poisonous salted earth to grow in. And then the other thing is, if you use a small footprint to begin with for these deep reforms, you have less special interest resistance than you might otherwise have statewide, and you also have less risk. For those that are concerned about what might happen there, you can say, look, this is in the middle of nowhere, it's far from everything, it's not going to affect you until we see that it's successful. When it's successful, then people can voluntarily join it. And then lastly, because the vast burden of regulatory effects is really federal. About 80%, according to some studies, is placing the blame on the federal government for regulatory burdens. The great thing about this SEZ, this special zone concept, is that we can upgrade it to federal reform. But then we often hear from folks, well, what difference is a small 1 square mile area going to make? Because that's the initial footprint outside of a city. We have to have at least a 1 square mile area, and probably they'll be larger. But folks say, well, that's just too small to impact things. And you have to forgive the next couple of slides because this is based on work we're doing in Arizona. We've been active with this concept now for over a year. We're in our going into our second fact-finding hearing tomorrow. But we have some great information based on that experience that we can share with you. If you look at this, you'll see that Hong Kong is tiny compared to Phoenix, compared to Arizona. And if you look at the GDP generated by Phoenix, it's pretty big. It's bigger than its relative service area, right? And if you look at the state as a whole, Phoenix's GDP is almost the entire state's GDP. So size is really not relevant to gross domestic product, what economic growth you can get out of this. But check out what Hong Kong is. Hong Kong's gross domestic product blows away the entire state of Arizona with just a tiny dot of land. Now, Hong Kong has a number of interesting things going for it that are distinct from a place like Arizona, but not all that distinct, because folks say that Hong Kong is this crossroads of international trade, but think about where Arizona is located, how close to Mexico, how it's between California and Texas. With the right policies in place, anywhere can become Hong Kong. And it goes bigger than just looking at the gross domestic product footprint. If you look at per capita, just keeping in mind how many people are there, and Hong Kong has a lot of people, you'll see that Hong Kong's per capita is far, far greater. So this point is not to say that everywhere that tries to form a prosperity community is going to become necessarily the same or as successful as Hong Kong, but it is to show that size is not relevant to good policy. You implant the best free market practices in a small area, and you are going to get results that blow your mind. Now, we've also had, through the good work at New Wave Foundation, an analysis of where things would go in Arizona that if we did allow for at least one prosperity community to form in Arizona. And this is a vision of where we see population and GDP going in 10 to 20 years. First of all, if you look at the prosperity zone, we're looking at it generating somewhere between Phoenix levels of growth and Hong Kong. If you look at per capita, you see even more growth potential according to our models, dramatic growth potential. If you look at the effect on the state, what's dramatic is if you look at the purple part of the bar, you see that outside of the prosperity district, this area that we call the prosperity community, there's tremendous increase in growth as well because of the spillover effects of having a dramatically good policy environment in your state, because there's going to be plenty of folks that don't want to live in the zone, that live on the periphery, and all the extra business that's traveling through the state and has to support the business in the prosperity district. So you're looking at a dramatic increase in growth in 20 years, visibly in 10 years. We had a study done over at the Arizona State University School, our Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, which looked at especially economic zones and great policy environments in various communities. And Professor Boys there, Professor Emeritus of Economics, found that you could very reasonably exceed 8% growth in any such free market best practices environment. An example that we'd like to point to, again, courtesy of the great work over at New Wave Foundation and their associates, is the dramatic difference that adopting the right policies made in Singapore. There was a time when Singapore was as poor could possibly be. And then they switched to a suite of mostly free market policies. Now there's a little bit of government direction in Singapore, but relative to what they had before, it is as dramatic as anything that would happen in a prosperity district, if not more so, relative to the United States. And you can see that they've blown past us on GDP per capita. I mean, just what, 5, 7-fold. You can also see that a counterexample or a model of bad policy in a small area of Cuba, and you can see that GDP per capita in Cuba has languished pretty much where it's always been, while Singapore is rocketing up. So great policy in small areas matters. People say, well, what about America? Where have we done anything like this in America? Now, we've done some great privatization ideas here and there. The Sandy Springs, Georgia comes to mind, where they contracted out most other than life safety services to a private company to operate, and it's cut costs by more than 10%, and some in the early days of it by 30-40%. And it's much more efficient. People love it. But that's not as deep and dramatic as what we're talking about. The clearest example in America where something similar to what we're talking about occurred is Disney World. Walt Disney said to the legislature of Florida in the late 50s, early 60s, I see you've got all this swampland around Orlando that nobody wants, and he basically convinced them to allow him to create a special district that would devolve to the district regulatory authority almost across the board, taxation authority almost across the board, and within 10 years you got the Magic Kingdom out of that. Now, I point to this example as proof in America that A, it can be done, and B, that it has been done, and C, that it generates the same dramatic explosive results. Now granted, Walt Disney is a unique individual, but in 10 years you got the same visible reaction to these policy changes that we're hoping will change the argument, that will win the argument by pointing around the country. The difference between our approach and the Disney World approach is that this is not a district for Disney World. This will be a district for anyone who meets objective criteria, not just because they happen to be, the guy who created Mickey Mouse. And we're going to create, and we have created, a model policy that leads to Disney Worlds of capitalism everywhere around the state that wants to have them as they prove themselves. So, who's ready for a deep dive, or at least a nearly deep dive into the model policy? I've circulated that around. In the Q&A, we can go through these specific sections, and I can point out where they're located. But for now, I want to just explain what the policy environment is that the prosperity district, and that's the term we're using legally, prosperity district, involves. And you'll notice on the slide it tells you where to find it. I'm referring right now to Article 2 of the Compact, the Prosperity States Compact model policy. And the first thing to emphasize is that there is no chance that the district has even a kernel of power or authority that will allow it to grow and become a monster. The district is uniquely designed to be strictly limited in its powers. And we've learned from, if we dare say, the mistakes that were made in the federal Constitution by not being coy about the limits on those powers. We don't, lay out a list of powers and then add a necessary proper clause and just hope that it's going to be interpreted the right way. So what powers does the district have? The district only has essentially 3 powers that mean anything substantively. First, it has police powers, but they're limited to regulatory best practices and what we call malum in se criminal law enforcement, or genuine, what I call genuine criminal law enforcement, where you're going after crimes that are of evil intent, that involve violence and theft and fraud, things like rape and murder and true criminal practices. Its police powers are limited to those types of criminal practices, those types of criminal activities, And then on the regulatory side, you'll see in the next slide just how good they are. But these are regulatory best practices designed on the model of regulatory impact statements, sunset, sunrise review, criteria developed in places like Mercatus and Cato Institute and various other top-level think tanks. Secondly, it can provide any set of municipal services, but it can't do it with a monopoly, right? So if it wants to have trash hauling, it can't say nobody else can handle it. If it does a service, it has to be competitively bid. And then even more importantly, either everyone who uses it has to pay for the service equally, or everyone in the community must agree to shoulder the cost if they're going to subsidize anyone. So there is not going to be the ability to use municipal services to buy votes if votes mattered in the district. And it won't be inefficient in the delivery of services because it will be driven by what actually is wanted in the community. And then thirdly, and this is the last significant power of the district, is there's some degree of borrowing. Now this is mainly an artifact of the tax advantages of municipal borrowing that we even had it in there. You can't really ignore those things. But we've limited the borrowing to the net assets of the district. So if the district doesn't have any assets of any significance, it will not be able to borrow. And to the extent that it does borrow, it's limited up to the assets it has. And this is something in effect at all times. So unless you have a district that has bountiful assets, it is not going to be borrowing very much. And then we are very clear what it doesn't have. It has no taxing authority, no eminent domain authority, no civil forfeiture authority, no subsidies for private enterprise, and no anti-competitive regulation at all. So you are looking at the leanest, tightest, most efficient local government there could ever be. So what are the best practices that it has? The district has the ability to adopt any regulation it wants in its initial charter when it's formed. They're training wheels. Those training wheels go away in 5 years because in 5 years every regulation is repealed in a sunset process. Any other regulations that are required first require a regulatory impact statement. Second, they have to be targeted to protecting third parties who could not have protected themselves. And third, they actually have to work. There has to be proof of efficacy. The burden of proof in any regulatory formulation or promulgation or enforcement is kept on the district at all times. And then all regulations, except for the underlying common law of property rights and contractual freedom, sunset every 5 years. So that in order to keep a regulation alive that initially jumped these hurdles, you have to jump them again, and then for the benefit of hindsight. So the basic concepts here are to put structures in place that prevent a regulatory state from growing and to make sure that regulation never serves any purpose other than protecting individual life, health, and safety, what we call individual life, liberty, and property. That is the best practices of regulatory policy that are built into the district. The fiscal best practices are also amazing for local control in local communities. All landowners, when they form the district, agree to a revenue covenant that will replace as much tax policy as can be repealed by mere statute. Some places have taxes that are required by constitutional law or by court decisions. Those things will remain. But as much of the tax policy that can be repealed is repealed in the zone and replaced with a voluntary agreement that will run with the land. We recommend a voluntary agreement that bases a revenue share on land values, that all taxing authorities will get a percentage of land values assessed every year in the district, and that will run with the land and bind all owners and all future owners, and naturally, because of market processes, be passed on to anybody who rents there or leases there as well. But we use the land value revenue idea as what we recommend because, according to Milton Friedman, it's the least bad tax. It's the only tax that doesn't directly disincentivize economic development. It's the only tax that doesn't punish income growth. It's the only tax that doesn't destroy wealth that is created. Instead, it's a tax based on the value that accrues because of the value of the community, right? If you think about the difference in the value of land versus the value of the improvements on the land, the element that is closest to what the general community, the safety, the peacefulness, the pleasantness of the environment, the element of value that is closely related to that is the land value. Whereas the improvements on the land is most closely related to the entrepreneurial efforts of individuals that really should accrue mostly to them. That shouldn't be taxed away. That shouldn't be given away. And so the land value revenue concept is viewed as the most economically efficient. It's viewed as the most equitable, and it's the one that we recommend. But we also allow for experimentation at the local level with other revenue concepts through a negotiated revenue approach, where the representatives of the people who form the district will negotiate with an agent of the governor, and then subject to legislative approval will reach a different kind of revenue covenant. And we don't presume to tell anyone what that different kind of revenue covenant might look like, except that whatever it is, everyone who has a district can also adopt it if they want, so that we can prevent special favors resulting in revenue covenants for special districts. So the basic limiting principle on what might be negotiated is that everyone who wants a district can benefit from it as well. And there are a lot of different revenue concepts that we should encourage experimentation with, but right now we're going with Milton Friedman. The other thing that's important to emphasize is that all of these revenue covenants are based on a stipulation that the state, the county, and all municipal authorities will receive, no matter what, as much revenue as was generated in that area from all sources prior to formation, or in the case of an expansion of a district, prior to expansion. So in nominal terms, this is revenue neutral. And if you do go with the land value approach, the real benefit here is that you align the interests of the taxing and spending authorities with the success of the district. Because if you go from a district that has land values in $1,000 or $2,000 per acre, and then the place in 10 years turns into the rough equivalent of Hong Kong, you're talking about a dramatic increase in land values, and the resulting accrual of revenue from that land value will cause natural enemies of this policy to be allied. It will align their self-interest with the success of the district, which is very important. So how do you create a prosperity community? This is all in Article 3 and Article 4. It's actually a very simple process, very similar to the formation of special districts, with the exception that we don't want any political friction in the process. In other words, if you meet the basic criteria to form it, you will get it as a ministerial matter without a political intermediary. And again, the reason for this is we don't want these districts to be created based on special favors, based on cronyism. And to create a district, basically you need a petition that lays out the details of its charter and its location and shows consent of everyone affected, and you submit that to the governor and the presiding officers of your legislature, and they review it ministerially for failing to dot I's and cross T's. And if it is not rejected in 20 days, it is approved. As soon as you take that same petition and record it with the County Recorder of Deeds, it is formed. And the moment it is formed, the overall legislation dictates that it will replace state law with all of the best practices that we've discussed in its boundaries. Now down the road, if we succeed in getting a second state to join the compact, and if we succeed in getting Congress to bless it with consent, either through a joint resolution, a concurrent resolution, implicitly, there's a variety of different ways it can consent we can talk about later. But if we get a second state in, if we form a compact, if we get Congress to consent to it, then federal laws will be replaced by all of the best practices that we just discussed as well. And you will have a true American version of the special economic zone concept that you've seen around the world in places like Dubai, Hong Kong, Shenzhen in China, and other cities in China that have special economic zones, and Dubai. Now you're probably saying right now, well, that sounds like a great pipe dream, and good luck with that. One of the things that we recognize is that the the full free market policy suite might not be ready for your political environment in your state. It may be. In some states it seems very attractive to folks. But we wanted to make sure you had the flexibility to move the Overton window, if you've heard of that concept. And so built into our legislation is an ability to tailor its policies to the state in unique ways. And we've talked about the formation of communities outside of cities. Inside of cities, we've empowered cities to have to opt in voluntarily into this formation process, and in doing that, they can also tailor how the district will operate within their boundaries. And so the way to think about this is the flexibility you need to in good policy terms adjust the practices that are outlined in the suite of free market practices to your state's unique environment, but in crass political terms enables you to handle a lot of special interest objections that you might find. I think the one interest that was very important in Arizona that I want to highlight is the impact of the district on federal grant money. Ironically, we're doing this to try to get people weaned off of federal grant money, but and to govern themselves. But as a practical matter, the legislature in Arizona is very concerned about whether a district could imperil. So one of the things you can put in the statewide tailoring is a provision, and we have an example of language that would prevent the district from doing anything to imperil a federal grant, even if that does diminish the workings of its full suite of reforms. There's other things you can do as well. So people say, oh my God, you're creating an Indian reservation. How is it going to, we can't control them, they can't do anything. So you get an initial, from some folks, some people say, well, you're creating this weird autonomous area inside of our state, and we can't control it and we're worried about it. And that's absolutely not what we're doing. These are districts, they're special districts, they're a type of political subdivision, they're subject to the state's constitution, they're subject to the federal constitution, they're subject to whatever you put in your statewide tailoring section. They're subject to existing compacts. The average state has 25 compacts that they are beholden to. So these are districts that are embedded in your state as part of your statewide governance. They are not another Indian reservation. And not only that, but we've made it very clear that the autonomy of the district depends on what's happening there not being criminal and staying there. To the extent that anything ever leaves the district that is a bad thing, an externality, a negative externality, outside agencies, outside political subdivisions can address them. To the extent that anyone in the district wants to try to free ride off of outside governmental services, our compact makes it very clear that they're going to have to pay for it. So to the extent that a prosperity community has an impact outside of its boundaries that is negative, all the usual tools that would exist in your state to remedy that problem will continue to exist. But if the district does manage to contain it and to not have any negative externalities and to not engage in criminal enterprises, then the district will be left alone. This seems to me the right alignment of incentives. Lastly, some folks are concerned about districts possibly going wrong. Human beings are fallible. Even with the right set of policies, you can't guarantee perfection. I think the most important thing to realize is that when you have something that has no taxation authority, its fiscal, what it gains is determined at formation through that revenue covenant. Since it has no further taxation authority, whatever crazy things it might try to do, it can't force anyone to pay for it, which is huge. The other thing is we deny the district sovereign immunity. It can be sued up and down, left and right. That is also something that keeps it in line. But I think the most important thing about the districts that keeps the check and the balance is that people can leave at will if they are in property that is next to the outside world, or if they can convince their neighbor that has property next to the outside world. They can file a very simple petition and within 20 days get out, revert back to the surrounding legal and jurisdictional environment. We also authorize the districts to include in their charter other ways that, of exit if they want. The reason why we require this continuity to the outside world is we don't want to Swiss cheese a district, because that would possibly undermine its ability to function. But we also think that by giving this general authority to devise local methods of exit in addition to what we've specified in the district, that folks forming these districts will find a way to deal with this in ways that we can't anticipate right now and will be fine for their community. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is that, let's say the revenue covenant isn't paid, whatever it may be. It very clearly authorizes foreclosure of the land, which means then the revenue authorities can acquire that property, and then they themselves could activate the reversion of the property back to their jurisdiction, or if it's more valuable in the district, then they could sell it just as they sell or offer for sale properties that don't pay their property taxes. So this is a district that has robust checks and balances built into it to keep it exactly what it is, a paragon of free market best practices. Finally, I say all this, and often I hear from my colleagues, well, why not just do it as a statute? Why not just pass a law and do all that? And why do this thing called a compact? Well, the simplest answer I give is, imagine you got all of this right. Imagine you created this perfect suite of free market best practices. You didn't have to trade away too much in the tailoring section, and you really got the job done right. You created a Disney World, right? Without the force of will of Walt Disney behind you, how long would that last? How many sessions would it take before they gutted it, right? How long would it be before it was captured with a tweak here and there by people who had clout? The problem with a statute is that you don't have the durability you need, both to maintain the policies and to create the environment that any investor on the scale of a Walt Disney is going to want to see. They're going to want to see that these policies aren't going to change for a decade or more. And you can't do that in statute. But a compact, because it's a contract and because it's enforced by the United States Constitution's Contracts Clause, is as binding on a state as a municipal bond, as a pension system, as any other contractual agreement. And therefore it does lock down the policy, potentially indefinitely, unless you guys tailor a limit to the length of time that it's in place. The other thing that's beneficial about a compact is if you're in an unfavorable federal judicial environment or an unfavorable state judicial environment, it gives you access to Supreme Court sanctioned alternative dispute resolution outside of the normal court system. And I say this to emphasize that the Supreme Court has strongly signaled in a case of New Mexico versus Texas back in the 1980s that it does not want to hear disputes in compacts, that it would vastly prefer that states in compacts settle their disputes outside of court. And in that case, the court specifically said it would like the Compact Commission to handle dispute resolution. The last point here, in addition to having access to alternative dispute resolution that can allow you to sidestep unfavorable court environments like the Ninth Circuit, if you're in Arizona, you definitely don't want to be stuck there, is a compact with congressional consent achieves the status of federal law. And we could talk about the reasons for that in the Q&A, but the bottom line is if you want to take this full suite of free market best practices and upgrade it to federal law, there is no other pathway that begins with state leadership, that allows you to prove the concept and break ground at the state level, and then present Congress with an actually non-abstract, concrete, successful effort underway when you pitch them on the need for their consent to upgrade this to federal law status. And let me just leave you with this final thought. Imagine if Disney World had been in a compact. What if it wasn't a district, but it was a compact that allowed, let's just broaden it, any state to have a similar development for any purpose. Imagine the difference that it would have made lobbying Congress for its consent to that compact, being able to point to what happened in the swamps outside of Orlando in just 10 years as an example of what happens when you remove just 20% of the regulatory burden that it would face. And you let them know that we believe that they are 80% of the burden. That vision would be more powerful than anything in securing that consent, and it certainly would be far more plausible than anyone would have thought 50 years ago that the neon lights of West Berlin would have brought down the Soviet Union. Thank you.